Turn off the light.
May of 2003 is almost finished. The class of 2003 at Plattsburgh State is finished, most of them. And we're back in Champlain Valley Hall with one of our favorite people in the whole wide world, Dr. Sylvie Beaudreau. How are you?
I'm very well, Gordy.
You were so neat in your little get-up at graduation.
You saw me looking like Red Riding
I love
Hood?
it. I pointed you out and hollered out loud, and people said, who is this fat guy, and why is he pointing to that lady in red?
The lady in red. Yeah, that outfit is a real killer outfit,
love
isn't it?
it.
Eh? Velvet and like white. It's Canadian colors, right? Red and white.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have that medieval-looking hat.
Oh, that's the best part of it.
Yeah.
I wish we had a picture of it to put up on the screen right now. How long have you had that?
I've had that since I graduated, so I've had
Really?
it since 1994.
Isn't
Yeah.
that cool?
And my mom has a picture of that on her in the living room. There's a picture of me wearing that hat, looking like a medieval sort of friar tuck or something.
I love it.
It's not very flattering, but it is quite like
How
striking.
did it feel walking down there and realizing that 9 out of 10 of everybody else you were walking with were at least 5 inches taller than you? I could hardly see you.
You couldn't see
among
me?
the-
I was so small? Oh, it's because I'm French Canadian, we're small.
Is that it?
No, I'm kidding.
It was great. It was a lot of fun. It's always wonderful for me and so rewarding for the kids who spend all their
Yeah.
time and finally get out of
I
school.
know, it's
And these
hard.
days, almost nobody makes it in 4 years. It's 5
Right.
years, 6 years.
Yeah, and it's just a positive moment. I mean, it's one of those. It's like a wedding or something. It's just a happy time, and it's good to be part of it.
Right at the end of commencement, somebody started throwing a rubber
Balloon.
beach ball.
Oh yeah.
And everybody's popping and it's going up, hitting people in the back of the head. And
Yeah.
you try to be a little somber, but
That's
toward
an
the
attempt-
toward
that's an
the
attempt-
end,
That's an attempt to kind of deflate a little bit of the pressure, by having a little bit of fun, So it's not all
it
that
was
serious.
great. I have to say, this is chapter 4, did you say, of the French Canadian? Yeah, chapter
Yes.
4. And you said you have a lot to go.
Oh yeah, we
I
have at
must-
least 10 maybe.
I must, 10? Okay,
so.
we'll plan on a decade. But I have to say that the response has been wonderful.
Oh wow.
The last time you said, yeah, but it's just me talking. Well, you're the one who knows what you're talking about.
Oh.
I just fill in the gaps while you drop pages on the floor.
I don't know.
Try
I
to
don't
get a
know.
slide to work and so on. But the response has been wonderful, and I know the response you've had is good. And even yesterday, as late as yesterday, I was in a store and somebody said, that lady. I said, I beg your pardon?
Yeah.
That French lady.
Yeah.
I want more.
Give us more of her. That's funny because I have to tell you that I watched, I think, volume 2, and I think at one point your microphone is like, I'm talking and you've got your microphone like this, and I could swear that at one point you look like you're falling asleep. So I thought, maybe this is like poor Gordy has to like sit through this.
Or just meditating so I could open my mind to accept more of that delicious information.
It's coming in. Oh,
Well,
absorbing.
it's something that many of us have taken for granted, although Calvin and I have talked about the French connection often because of his heritage and the heritage of people who live around him in the Champlain-Rouse's Point area. But never has anybody marched right up front with this idea until you came to town.
Oh, that's so lovely that you say that.
It's just so terrific. And the response, I had a couple of people this past week who said, St. Peter's. And I said, what do you mean? Well, when she talked about St. Peter's, wasn't that wonderful how St. Peter's got started in that black and the whole thing?
Yeah.
People were mesmerized.
And I'm discovering more as I go along. I'm discovering secrets and mysteries and little known things that people didn't know about, which I'm going to hold back for my, episode number 7 maybe. Right?
Oh, you've got to keep us coming back.
Because, what happens is, a lot of the stuff I'll learn by driving somewhere or discovering an old cemetery or going up to, Chazy and tooling around and finding out stuff up there. And so what happens is, I get, little pieces, almost here and there, any typical researcher. Or else you go to special collections and you find that, a Catholic nun wrote a history of the parish of St. Peter's in the 1950s, and, you look at her work and you find out things from her. And so you end up having a lot of information, but see, the thing is you can't immediately sort of come out and say something about it because basically you have to put those pieces into some kind of larger context, and hopefully you want to have as well flushed out a picture as possible to present. Because if you keep just, it is fun to give anecdotes here and there, but I think like the role of the historian, as opposed to just, I guess, someone who's an archivist or an antiquarian, is to kind of give it a kind of larger significance. And so you have to be patient if you're a historian, because it's like long. I mean, as everyone knows, Calvin knows, and you know it, when you do research and you do writing, it's always a long, process of obscure kind of, tooling around in archives, going to cemeteries, putting together the pieces. So I'm discovering more and more, and the more I discover, the more I say, wow, this is. I don't know what the word for it is. I'm completely immersed in this subject.
You get passionate. We use the word passion a lot. And before we began our program today, we talked about how we're compensated for what we do in life. And my compensation has not always been monetary, Calvin's either, and many times yours. You get passionate at something, and the amount of money you make for it isn't your driving force.
Right, it's
immaterial. And so it really
way.
Doesn't matter. It's nice to be able to put food on the table.
Absolutely.
But beyond that, you do stuff that you're passionate about.
Oh yeah, and I feel really privileged that I'm in this place here, and I have the resources, and especially now when I'm not teaching, I can really devote myself to it, full time. And so I feel really kind of privileged that I'm able to do that. Like I can, go out and do this work, and it intrigues me, but it also brings a lot to the community. So it's, I'm in the right place at the right time.
And the institution supports you in the effort?
The institution supports me in the effort. I actually believe that's probably why I was hired here in the first place. Is because because I have this interest in French-Canadian migration, and I mean, what better subject for this area? So my department has encouraged me to develop this, and is looking forward to even more work. So it's something good's gonna come out of it. Yeah.
You spent literally hundreds of hours on the project so far.
Yeah.
Goodness knows what roads it's going to lead you down.
Someone emailed me and said to me, someone who knew me, a sister of one of my former students who had invited me to a graduation party at their place a couple of years ago, she emailed me and said, Dr. Beaudreau, your presentation was, I saw you on TV, it was so good, you had so much information that, you should write a book on, you must write a book on this, and I thought, wow, that's really nice, She's probably right, I probably should write a book on this.
And you will.
No doubt. Yeah, there's a lot of resources that need to be looked at, though it's a big project. You'd have to go to St. Peter's, their archive. You'd probably have to go to Ogdensburg for the diocesan archives. You'd probably have to go to Quebec and go to the Oblates archives, if they, if they have papers on Plattsburgh, which I'm sure they do. They're somewhere, because they don't get rid of those things.
Yeah.
They just, they streamline them or put them in a different place, but they're certainly accessible. And I've done research in religious archives in Quebec before, and I know what it's like. That too is a lot of work.
Yes,
because typically they have things like, they kept very good records. They would keep copies, and they would write them, like they would send out a letter, but for every letter they sent out, they wrote the letter in a book, right? And that's why actually writing the history of French Canada and even genealogy is really easy to do for French Canada, because the church kept magnificent records of births, deaths, marriages, and unless the church burned down, and then you lose it, right? And the religious orders that worked in places like Plattsburgh and Malone and Burlington, Vermont, kept really good records of what they did. But the problem is, the copies of the letters that are in the books are written in the books, and you can't photocopy those because the books are kind of old and crumbling, and you can't crack them open and put them on a photocopier. So sometimes you can do it, but sometimes you can't. You literally have to sit there and just
take photographs, though, couldn't you?
They don't have the maybe I could, but I don't know.
You could take digital photographs.
Maybe I could at this point.
I think
But
probably.
then like the letters are written in manuscript, right, and in French. So you've got to sit there and try to figure out what's written here. And sometimes it's 19th century French, and they'll have strange expressions like hair of the dog, or some.
Oh, sure. Well,
and you go, oh, what is this? What is this?
The
And
same things occur in translations of Middle English and Old English in
Yeah,
our own language,
yeah.
or in any other language. And as difficult it is, to find this information, it's easier than if you had to go to Spain.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Or
For me,
even-
it's not
or even
hard for
England or
me.
Scotland or
Right,
Ireland, so,
right.
and you're so familiar with the language. But
Yeah.
I've seen local historians take documents from the 17th century and try to interpret the language,
God.
especially if it's written in cursive language
Yes.
by somebody who wasn't well educated, because spelling wasn't a big factor with
Oh,
these
it
people.
was, spelling was optional, or it was
Yeah.
like, wildly impressionistic. Yeah.
But anyway, this is a project you're doing mostly on your own, right? Or are you using some interns, or?
I'm doing this on my own, but I have to I think I want to start some kind of like program or internships, or maybe a center of Franco-American studies, or, French-Canadian
Wonderful
heritage.
idea.
Yeah.
I think now would be the time.
Yeah, I think the time would be good for something like that. And, Angela Brown at Hill and Hollow?
Very well.
Yeah, she does wonderful stuff too with the French. She has that French Heritage Week in the winter, which also brings attention to that. And that's also I spoke to them about French Canadian music, and they loved it. I mean, there was
Of course they did.
600 people in the audience, and they were laughing and they were applauding, and they were just enjoying getting a feeling of what their culture sounded like, or knowing some of the themes of the music. And so there was this,
What better person to present it than Angela, huh?
Oh,
What a
absolutely,
voice.
absolutely, yeah. She and Kellum do really good work for. I mean, they sense that this is an interesting and integral part of this local area, and they're and Saranac itself is a really sort of
Of course it is.
French historical area, yeah. So.
There's these little pockets of culture
Yeah.
really please me around the area, because some folks would think that we're a little bit backwoodsy up here, but we think we've got a
true.
lot of things going for us.
We certainly do.
You're one of them, they're
Yeah.
one of them, and there are many others. That's why it's so special that you
Yeah.
invite us back here today.
Oh, I
We
love-
made you burn the midnight oil to get ready for today.
That's right. I learned PowerPoint in 24 hours.
I think that's terrific. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, today I thought we would take a little bit of a break from the historical narrative, which we of course have to resume at some point. But I thought, since we've been toying around with this idea, that I would present to you something on North Country names, or Old French names of the North Country, because the more I work on this, the more I discover, the more I get a sense that it's hard to know the extent to which the local, regional, like Clinton, Essex, and Franklin County, the population of those counties, it's hard to kind of get an estimate of what percentage of that population can claim French heritage. And when I first arrived here, I thought it was, maybe 1/3. And then a couple of years ago, I began to think maybe it's half. And now I've gotten to the point where I think it's like 75%.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah,
And it'll
because-
keep going up.
I know, because now I'm realizing that there's a lot of names that look and sound English, but that are not English. They're actually, Anglified, is that a word? Anglicized, not Anglified, Anglicized French names. And so if you just go through the phone book like the North Country phone book, and look at all the names, it's like looking almost at a Quebec phone book. So I was intrigued by this, and I just find it really fascinating to see the process whereby these names kind of morphed, or it's surprising. I sometimes make these discoveries, and a light goes off, right, and I go like, oh, that's what that name is. And here's what I think is interesting. I mean, when I see this, I wonder if someone whose name is like Ashline, like let's say there's like one of my students who's like 18 years old and her name is Jessica Ashline, she might not have any clue whatsoever that she has French heritage, but because it might be so many generations ago, and there might have been intermarriage in the middle.
Don't care until you present it to them, and then they'll say, "Oh, wow."
Really?
Listen, we're
Yeah.
going to stop for one moment to
Sure.
check our tape and continue. We're speaking with Dr. Sylvie Beaudreau at Plattsburgh State. The French Connection, that's what we're talking about, and we're going to get into some names today. I love it.
Yeah, we're going to get into some names, but before we do that, I thought that what I would do is talk about, I want to kind of give a bit of historical background as to why, okay, I'm sure that between you and Calvin, you guys can come up with the most common North Country French names. Okay, so let me put you on the spot. what do you think are some of the most common names? The most sort of typically North Country names?
Well, we
And you know what we'll do, here's what's interesting. By the end of my presentation, we'll see if you guys were right. Because like when I did this, I have certain working hypotheses. So maybe I should qualify what I'm doing to make sure that you know that what I'm about to present is not scientific. It's impressionistic, right? So some of the things I have, like when I look, this is what I think, another thing that's interesting too is because I'm from Quebec, because I lived in Quebec, I'll look at a name and I can immediately recognize what the original name was. And I'll explain to you why that is in a minute. So I'm looking at the names and I'm kind of guessing that this is what the name was originally. And in most cases, I'm about 100% sure that's what the name was. In some cases, I'm like 75% sure. Sometimes I'm not so much on solid ground. Because sometimes a name has changed so much that it could be either this name or that name, or it could be either none of those. So I selected a certain amount of names by looking at the phone book, first of all, which is a good source to start with. And what I'm going to present today is obviously not extensive, because if we were to do this properly, we'd be here for weeks probably. So like when your viewers watch this, I want them to just note that if their name doesn't come up, don't be discouraged, because what I've done is somewhat scientific but somewhat random and impressionistic, and I only chose names that have been anglicized. So that if your name is Bourgeois and it's remained Bourgeois, I'm not going to mention that one because it's obviously a French name. Right, so what I'm searching for is like the secret French names, or the unknown French names, or the ones that have morphed to the point of non-recognition. So and so in the process of doing this, certain names have maybe 1 or 2 different spellings, but then there are other names that have like 5 or 6 or 8, 9 or 10 different variations, right?
Or 30 or 40, like
62.
or 62, Rabideau.
Rabideau.
62 that we know of. It's almost like Shakespeare. I mean, that used to be the joke when I first studied Shakespeare. How many ways can you spell Shakespeare?
Right.
But then
How many ways can you spell Rabideau?
Rabideau. Or Duquette.
Well, did you know, though, but here's what's interesting, too, is that apparently Rabideau is the same name as Roby. Oh, no, sorry. No, that's Robitaille. Sorry, I got it totally mixed up. No. I'm correcting myself. Right, there you go. It's not scientific. Yeah, so no, you're right. So there's like many ways to spell it. So we can impressionistically rattle off some of the names of the North Country, like Rabideau. What else?
La Fountain, Lefebvre, Lamarche.
Anything with law, right?
Laframboise.
Anything with law, pretty much, with a law in it. Tremblay. How many ways?
We don't know about Castine.
Castine's not a huge one, I don't think. No.
Even if it's a little
But we have some little ones here. It doesn't matter how many there are, but I just wanted to like use this as an exercise. What are we missing? Leduc.
Sure.
The Ledouxs and the Leducs and Laduc and Leduc.
Yep.
And it goes on and on. But here, those are the names that we come to mind. Tremblay, Rabideau, Leduc. There's too many to name. But I want to sort of give your viewers a sense of why it is that there are these really large families that all have the same name. And that's not just a local thing, that has something to do with the history of Quebec or New France. So we're going to start off by going back to what they would call, in French they would call it le peuplement, the peopling of New France. Like who came to New France, why, and when. There's something unique or different that happened in New France that explains why it is that there's this there's this small number of family names, but there's a large amount of each of them. So that's what I want to begin by talking about a little bit. And let's start by looking at where are my big phone books. I'd rather do this though.
Yeah, we have to pause for a moment and tell our viewers, some of whom might have been taken classes from you over the past year, that the grading will occur.
Yes.
You probably should be in your study right now.
That's right, grading. Well, we assure a guaranteed product here, so the grades will be in by tomorrow at noon.
I love it. You got a phone book, and there's a good reason for that.
Yes, I brought 2 phone books because I wanted to just show something to you. I want to show you some similarities. So here's like the North Country telephone directory. I'm using this one because it serves the Tri-County area, so it's the best one for it. And then there's a Montreal phone book from 1999. And I just turned like the page to Trombley, right? One of those common names. And we see here that there's Trombley, and it starts off spelt with E-E, O-E, with an O and then an EY, and then it goes on and on. It's mostly with an O, though. Isn't that interesting? That the North Country Tromblays are with an O. And then there's Trombley, and then there's
Probably
Trombley.
some TREs over here,
Oh, and there's
too.
some Tromblays. Okay, so we have one page here. We have a whole page here of Tromblays, right? And then, yeah, so there's quite a few of them. But they're all
The
spelled
common
differently.
question is, when you say your name is Trombley, with or without the E?
Right.
And, you know, I've
You
dealt
mean like
with it.
this one here that doesn't have an E? Like
Yeah,
that? Right.
yeah.
Well,
So
there's a
with or
lot of
without the E,
variations.
There's a lot of both and many variations. That's a good example that you turned to.
Well, what's interesting, there's the right spelling. Now, who knows what's the right one? Well, I can tell you this is a right one. Tremblay. How do I know that? Well, that's pretty easy, because if you live in Quebec, you know that there's really only one way to spell Trombley, and let's have a look at it. But you will be amazed by this, because, here we go. There we go. Starts with Tremblay with an E, and then an A. Look at the pages of Tremblay, and they're all the same.
My goodness.
They're all the same, right, Gordy? See,
Yeah.
Gordy's my witness that they're all the same.
They're all the
There's no
same.
variations in the spelling. Okay, so there's
How is that, how is our street spelled here? It's Tremblay. Yeah, it's Tremblay here.
they got it right for the street. That's good.
Oh, thank God they got it right.
They got it right. Well, have a look at this. Look at this. Another
On and
on and on and on. Look at this. Look at this. It's amazing. They're all spelled the same, though, right? 6 pages we're at now.
Not that it counts that this is one of the largest cities in North America.
Right. 7 pages. Yeah,
Yeah.
7 pages of Tremblays,
Yeah.
but they are all spelt the same way. There's no variation whatsoever. Look at the last one. And then there's no. Oh, one guy dropped it. Here's one guy who's out of the loop here. He dropped his A. But there's only 1 out of 6 pages, right?
I dropped my A a few times, too.
You
Okay.
dropped your A.
Yeah,
Right.
A.
No TROs? Any TROs?
No. They're all the same. So here's the magic question, or the big question. Maybe we can deduce from that there's a lot of Tremblays in Quebec. Therefore, there's a lot of Tremblays in Plattsburgh. That's one way of looking at it. It's a big name in Quebec, therefore it's a big name locally. But we know that there's probably another. Tremblay is one of many common names in Quebec, as we will discover in a minute. And so this is what I want to start off with, is finding out. Now, if you look at the Montreal phone book and look at other names, what you'll find. Okay, let's look at Cody, right? Look at the name Cote, C-O-T-E, right? Again, you have pages, like pages and pages of Cote, all spelled the same. Look at all the Codes, right? Mm-hmm. And then Cossette, all the same. Cormier. So there's this real sense in French Canada. Look at the Brousseaus, they're all spelled the same.
Oh, sure.
So there's a sense in Quebec that there's like these really well-known common names, and a lot of people share those names. And if you go to any part, and this is Montreal, if you go to a small town, like for example, like let's say you were going to go not to, like a city like Plattsburgh, but in Quebec, like Sorel, right, where my mother's from. Go up the Richelieu River to where it meets the St. Lawrence. There's a city called Sorel. It's about the same size as Plattsburgh. And if you look at their phone book, Montreal is much more diverse. It's got, it's had a lot of immigration, so there's a lot more Anglophones, and there's a lot more like names from various immigrant groups. But if you go to like rural Quebec, where it's like 100% French, you'll just see the phone book, and it'll be like page after page of the same name. And there'll be like a group of names, and everyone knows that those are the people from that region, and they know that they're from here and they're not from here, based on their name. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a reason for that, and I want to explain to you what that is, what it goes back to. So basically, why it is that there's like a small group. So my hypothesis, or what I want to convey to you and to your viewers, is the sense that the province of Quebec, or French Canadian society, has this phenomenon of big major names that a lot of people share. And I'm going to try to explain to you why that is. There's a historical reason for that. And what it goes back to is the fact that New France, unlike New England, was never a popular destination for immigrants. In fact, I mean, I'm sure your viewers know this, that New France in its early days was more of a glorified trading post than it was a settlement colony. So if you want to make a distinction between New England and New France, but for purposes of comparison, what you find is that New England from the outset was founded by religious dissidents, people who were seeking religious toleration and refuge in a new country. So, and it was a lush, relatively places like Virginia and Maryland were fairly lush, warm, fertile places that were very much suitable to settlement. They had long growing seasons. You could grow tobacco and cotton and cash crops. So the English, I suppose, had the benefit of having discovered the eastern seaboard, and the French explorer Jacques Cartier discovered the St. Lawrence. What did Jacques Cartier say when he sailed by the coast of Labrador? He said, "This is the land that God gave to Cain."
Oh, wow.
Right. This is the land that God gave to Cain, which means this is the crappy land, or this is the hostile place, right? Because the coast of Labrador is just it's like fjords and massive rock and nothing growing on it. So he was Cartier was he wrote all this down. He said, "Where am I?" Of course, he thought he had discovered maybe the passage to the Far East, but he said this is a hostile place. So, and if you look at the history of what visitors thought of New France, I mean, so Cartier comes, he lands in he makes a landing in the bay of the Bay of the St. Lawrence, and he landed there on, I believe it was August 13th, which was the feast day of St. Lawrence in France. And because he landed there on August 13th, which was the feast day of St. Lawrence, he decided to name this bay the St. Lawrence Bay. And the rest, as we know, is history, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that the St. Lawrence River, the mighty St. Lawrence River, this huge maritime waterway, got its name because of a Catholic reason, because it was discovered by Cartier on this Catholic feast day. So Cartier, was looking for gold and spices in the passage to the Orient, and what he found was a kind of frigid wilderness peopled by, fur-bearing animals and strange-looking Aboriginal peoples who didn't speak any kind of language he could understand. So the history of New France has really been the history of, that explorers like Cartier expected to find gold and vast riches, and they found none of that. But what they did find was fur-bearing animals, and as you know, particularly the beaver, from which you could make felt, right? So beaver was used in Europe to make a very thick, glossy felt with which they shaped these gentlemen's hats. Those big fancy floppy hats with plumes?
Yes,
yeah,
sure.
That was called a beaver hat. And then later on in the 19th century, they made these top hats out of it. So this kind of felt made of beaver dander was kind of dense and thick and waterproof and shiny. You could dye it and make it really shiny black. So beaver pelts were worth their weight in gold. And you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with North Country names? There is a connection. It's coming. It's taking a long time for this to come out. But meanwhile, it's not a bad story, right? Yeah. So essentially, the French discovered this hostile place with long winters, short growing season. So Cartier discovers it, and it was really Champlain in 1608 that founded the city of Quebec. Champlain had tried in 1603 and 1604 to found a colony in present-day Nova Scotia and then New Brunswick. He founded a city called Port Royal, but he found it to be so cold and exposed to the ocean sort of winds and kind of too distant, too bleak. And in 1608, Champlain decided to forego his maritime colony and to establish himself at Quebec City. So Champlain is really seen, Cartier is like the discoverer of New France, but Champlain is seen as the founder of the colony. And so here was the problem with New France in its earliest years. New France was basically involved in the fur trade. This is the Europeans had an interest in the New World societies primarily to extract wealth. They weren't fools. They were looking for resources of some kind to aid the mother country. And not having found vast amounts of gold or silver, as the Spanish did in Mexico, the French exploited the fur trade using the Aboriginal people as workers. They did the trapping, not the French people. So a relationship emerged between the French and the Huron who did the trapping, at least initially. So, right, so essentially the early government of New France was carried out by fur trade monopolies. This is getting to my point about settlement. Because the first fur trade monopoly in the 17th century was called the Company of 100 Associates, La Compagnie des 100 Associés, which means 100 sort of people who hold stocks in the company, a joint stock company. And so the French gave this company the exclusive right to trade in furs. But in return for this, they had to govern the colony and they had to bring out a certain number of settlers every year as part of the deal, right? You know, okay, you can exploit the fur trade, you can make money out of it, but you have to govern, set up institutions, you know, support the Catholic Church. But as part of your deal in the contract, you will see that it's written you've got to bring out X amount of settlers every year. So in the ships going out to France, you're sending furs, but coming back, you got to bring some settlers. Well, no surprise that, you know, these fur trade monopolies did a very good job exploiting the fur trade. They didn't do such a good job on the second part of the deal. They had a lot of trouble bringing out settlers. In fact, they didn't really succeed in doing that. The only people that came to New France were young men interested in engaging in the fur trade. And apparently a few seasons of the fur trade, you could make you a wealthy man. So it was like the lottery. So essentially the people that were coming to New France were single young men intent on making a quick buck, as we would say today, and then going back to France with their profits. And as you can all imagine, this is not a good way to found a permanent colony, because what you're having is these temporary kind of migrants who come just to exploit the fur trade and then they want to, you know, go back to France. You're not going to in Canada they would say ça fait pas des enfants forts. It doesn't make strong children, you know. You don't have any children because you have no marriages and no permanent settlement. So in the early history of New France, there was this conflict between the fur trade and settlement because they were kind of antithetical. Because if you settled the colony, you'd be putting up fences, you'd be engaging in agriculture, and there'd be no more fur-bearing animals. So, you know, what's the word? The spread of a settlement frontier would eliminate the wilderness that was required for the fur trade. So these two things, you have to sort of imagine that they were like these sort of, there was this tension or this struggle to engage both in the fur trade but also to encourage colonization. And it was a real hard sell because most young men would prefer going up and trading furs in the North Country, the true North Country, right up in the Ottawa Valley or beyond. A quick buck in the fur trade was preferable to like 20 years of backbreaking labor clearing land, right? So it was get rich quick versus get old and tired and, you know, and moderately, you know, well established, right? So the choice was really clear. So what I'm trying to, you know, sort of get to is this idea that New France historically was seen as what we would call today a hardship post. There's two things that are going on. First of all, the French in general, France as a country has never been a great source of people leaving. And for various reasons which are kind of too complicated to go into now, because that'd be a whole episode, the peasants of France in general were well-fed and relatively happy and felt no need to leave for very complex historical reasons. Whereas in England, the peasantry was largely expropriated by landlords who wanted to engage in, what's the word, raising sheep, yep. Right? So you had this agricultural revolution in England that preceded the Industrial Revolution. They wanted to engage in large-scale sort of sheep grazing, and they expropriated peasants in what was called the enclosure movement. And those expropriated peasants went to either the big cities to work in factories, or they left and went to the New World, right? So England was the British Isles were a great sort of source of people leaving. Southern Italy, there's many countries that, you know, Ireland, of course, during the famine. But for various reasons, the French did not leave in great numbers. There was no mass exodus of French peasants. No real sort of impetus within France that would cause them to want to repel or to be repelled or to want to leave. Okay, so where am I going with this? That basically what you had coming to New France, typically, no one really left France except for the hardiest of souls. No one would leave France to take a dangerous trip across the North Atlantic to end up in a frigid wilderness that is, it's impossible to imagine how remote New France would be to a European with the technology that existed at the time. It was a huge leap of faith and a huge, what's the word, risk. So you could almost say that it was only the most intrepid, brave spirits that would do this. And of course, some of the bravest spirits were the missionaries. Because another reason why France was interested in the New World was the lure of converting what they considered the pagans to Christianity. They believed that they would come and save these people's souls.
Of course.
And the Jesuits did this, and the Jesuits came to New France, and they kept records of this. They wrote letters back to their mother house, and these letters were eventually published in France. And this created a great sensation amongst young religious men that they wanted to become a Jesuit and go to the New World and and experience the tortures and the kind of the struggle to see if they could maintain their faith against these horrific odds. So you had missionaries who came for the purpose of conversion of native people, but as far as lay people coming, all you had was people who were what you call like contract laborers. People that young men that the fur trade companies would hire with a contract and say, Jean-Baptiste Lemoine engages himself to trade in furs for this company for this amount of months in this place and to return with this amount of goods, etc. These men were called, engagés, which means engagement. You take an engagement to go trade in furs. So you had, indentured servants or contract workers coming to New France kind of against their will or not really intending on settling. It's like a way of getting a job. It's like going to work on an oil rig or something today, just going to some place where you can make some money. So what emerged in New France was a society that was populated by young single men who were, and I wanted to show your viewers, if you're interested in this subject, there's a very good book that has come out recently. It's by Peter Mook, and it's called La Nouvelle France, The Making of French Canada, A Cultural History. And this book, I wrote a review of this book for an academic journal, and you can all see that I've actually read it, which is pretty amazing, right?
That's good.
Yeah, it's always good to know that
It's
always good to know that you read the books that you review, right? So let's look at some of the title, the chapters. It says, "The difficulty of finding settlers for New France." And the reluctant exile of Manon Lescaut's countrymen. So it's a reluctant exile of those who did. That's chapter 4. What else comes on? Yeah, sea voyagers and bonhomme terrebonne. What's that about? Yeah, sea voyagers and bonhomme terre-neuve, newcomers' receptions and appeals to come home. This talks about the actual voyage from France to New France. Got some great images here. Here's a gang of convicts like those dispatched to the colonies. So some convicts came to New France.
Sure they did.
Want to see this? Here's a caricature showing a group of convicts being sent to New France, which probably illustrates, it's like going to Australia, or it's like to go to New France was like being exiled to some no man's land that you wouldn't really survive, right? So it's a little bit, I guess Canada is a place like Australia, not, at least initially. So yeah, there's the convicts lining up to go to New France. So you can see that it's a hardship post. Right, so this whole thing shows you, this book is fascinating because it shows you that the main problem of New France was finding settlers. Yeah, and there's a chapter on magic and religion. It's good stuff. So let me tell you how New France let me tell you how it got some settlers. Something happened. I want to explain that. So let's imagine that because of this coming of young single men to either work in the fur trade or be employed by a master somewhere in New France doing something else, you have a society where there are 8 men for every woman, right? So New France had this demographic imbalance, which, I mean, try to imagine that, right? There's 8 men for every woman, which means that in New France, if you're a woman, you get married when you're like 13, because there's this urgent need of women. And what's interesting as well, a kind of side story to that, is that many of the men who did go up north to trade in furs, they were so desperate for women's companionship or so lonely that they would engage in, I guess, you know, what's the word? They took native women as sort of what they called country wives. They called it, in French, they called it mariage à la façon du pays, which means marriage in the fashion of the country. Which kind of means informal marriage, or I guess today we would call it like shacking up, right?
Yeah.
My students would call it hooking up, right? This
Hooking
is
up,
the hookup,
yeah.
right? It happens downtown, right, all the time,
Yeah.
the hookup, right? So you actually had intermarriage and families, mixed blood families emerging in Western Canada, the result of French traders from the Northwest Company and Scottish traders later on from the Hudson's Bay Company taking native women as wives. So this shows us that in New France there was a shortage of women. And if you don't have women, you don't have families, and you don't have a permanent colony. And we all know that women keep men down in the home, right? They keep them from wandering, right? This is typically what women will do, right? You know, you're not going to get a man to want to settle down and start cutting down, clearing land if he's by himself, you know, and lonely. But if he has his wife with him and his children, then, you know, there's a more likelihood that it will survive. So the French were extremely concerned about the failure to establish this colony on a more permanent basis. So the lack of women was seen as a kind of really big problem that had to be settled. And the solution came, and we're finally getting to my point that I wanted to make. The solution came in 1663, when King Louis XIV, no less, right, the greatest king of royal France, the so-called Sun King, who dazzled the courts of Europe at a time when France was when Louis XIV came to power, France was the military, the political, and the cultural master of Europe. France had a bigger army than any other country, better trained, better equipped. Politically, France had united under its king as no other country had. And culturally, in terms of matters of clothing, food, dance, and music, the court of Louis XIV was the style sort of master of the world. Everyone wanted to emulate the French, and so this desire to want to eat like a Frenchman, be like a Frenchman, dress like a Frenchman, all this stuff goes back to the greatest age of France, which was Louis XIV's reign. So Louis XIV was a very capable administrator amongst many things, a man of letters and a scholar and all kinds of wonder. They called him Le Roi Soleil, which means the Sun King. Mm-hmm. He was so dazzling that he what's the word? He radiated. Right. So Louis XIV decides that New France will not survive unless he takes it under his own control. Right. So he decides that this idea of having fur trade monopolies govern the colony is not working. The only way to make New France a permanent colony is to literally take it under his wing. So in 1663, Louis XIV inaugurates what comes to be known as so-called royal administration of New France, meaning literally that New France was going to be administered by the king directly, royal administration. So, of course, let's be like, what's the word? Let's be realistic. Louis XIV is not going to come to New France and govern it directly, but what he's going to do is bring it under his purview or take responsibility for it. And what he is assisted in this in his extremely capable his right-hand man in this is Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the great French administrator, the great ultimate bureaucrat. So Colbert is really the one that's going to administer, or he's going to kind of make decisions about what should be done, by consulting with King Louis XIV. So King Louis XIV is also the man that said, "L'État, c'est moi," which means the state is me. I am the state. I am the government, right? was an absolute monarch, right? Untempered by any kind of democratic, pretensions. So l'État, c'est moi. He's the state, and he's going to govern New France on his own. So Louis XIV decides that there's the best way to deal with this problem of lack of women in New France. There's two things that happen that are very interesting. So New France comes under royal administration in 1663. And historians will argue that from 1663 onward, this is the glory days of New France. So imagine that, like, from the time that Cartier sailed into the Bay of St. Lawrence in 1534, from that moment on, Champlain comes in 1608, and even from 1608 onward, New France is kind of a fledgling colony. It's struggling. It's involved in fur trade. It's being attacked by the Iroquois. It's a dangerous place. De Maisonneuve, who founded the city of Montreal, when he decided to put a city next to an old Iroquois campground, because Montreal used to be called Hochelaga, right? And when Maisonneuve decided to build a village in Hochelaga, his colleagues told him he was crazy. He was going to get killed by the Iroquois. And he said something, I think Maisonneuve said, if every tree on the island turned into an Iroquois, I would still build my colony there. That's how much faith he had. So this was a dangerous place, and a place that no one wanted to settle in. So here's what's interesting. So from 1663 onward, I want you to try to see that from being a fledgling, struggling colony, from 1663 onward, you suddenly have this kind of age of, like, glorious achievement, and many of the problems are solved. And so the first problem was subduing the Iroquois. So Louis XIV realized that this colony will never be a success as long as the Iroquois are a menace. Being a good sort of geopolitical strategist, he figured this out. So Louis XIV sent a regiment of crack troops to do this. And this regiment was called Le Régiment Carignan-Salière, named after two of its leaders, Carignan-Salière. And they were sent out to subdue the Iroquois, and they succeeded in doing so. And when they finished their campaign against the Iroquois, there was a temporary peace treaty signed. Louis XIV happened upon an interesting idea. He said to the men, he asked the men, he said, they had been, now here were French soldiers, veterans. They had been to New France, they'd waged war in the worst conditions, and now Louis XIV, or his representative Colbert, said to the men, not literally, but came upon this idea of, I gotta backtrack. One of the things that Louis XIV did to administer the colony is he created two positions. One was the governor. The governor would be in charge of external affairs, military affairs, peace treaties with the natives, waging war, diplomacy. That was the governor's role. Louis XIV and his administrator Colbert created a new position called the intendant, the intendant. The intendant was to be appointed by the king and would be responsible for domestic affairs, raising taxes, building roads, settling the colony, administering the colony, legal affairs, right? So domestic matters. So the person chosen to be the first intendant was a man called Jean Talon. You might have heard in Montreal the Jean Talon Market,
of course.
yes, or the Jean Talon Street, Jean Talon metro station.
Yeah.
So Jean Talon arrived in New France in 1665 with royal instructions to encourage clearing of land, to promote industries, and to put this settlement on a permanent basis. And Talon, after the, imagine that in 1663, the French, 1666, the French march into Mohawk country, and in 1667 they sign a peace treaty with the Mohawk. And once the peace is established, Talon thinks of the great idea of offering the officers and the men of this regiment free land to settle in New France, which is a brilliant idea, because by doing that, you're not just going to get settlers, but you're going to get soldier settlers. You're going to get warriors that'll settle the land. So better chances of fending off any potential future Iroquois hostilities if you have a colony that's peopled by soldiers. So this is thought to be a good idea. So there were about 1,000 officers and men in this regiment, and 400 of them accepted to settle in New France. And and of course the officers got really large land grants, they got seigneuries, and then they parceled off their land to their soldiers, right? Gave their land to their soldiers. So my mom lives in Sorel, and she lives on we don't call them rural roads, but she lives on a seigneurial Rhin, and it's called the Rimbaud. And the name Rimbaud, I asked her what it was, and she said that was, Rimbaud was one of the officers of the Régiment Carignan-Salière. So, right, so now suddenly you had 400 new settlers, and these were men that had seen the country, had known of its potential, knew of its hard winters, and were more likely to make a go of it, make a success from it. So this is all very good. So now you're looking at me and you're saying, okay, we got 400 extra men, but what about the women, right? Where are the women? Not going to have a good settlement unless you have some women. These men need brides. So Louis XIV has a very good idea. He decides that this colony needs women, and essentially here's what he does. Louis XIV lives in Paris, which is the cultural capital of the world, and realizes that there's a lot of orphan girls in the orphanages of Paris. Motherless children, people whose parents died, girls of all social classes that, because their parents died, ended up in an orphanage. And the orphanages were run by nuns, by religious orders. And these young girls, ranging from the age of 11 to 16, have really no future other than, the kind of education that they've gotten. So Louis XIV decides to send, to invite shiploads of young women, orphan girls of Paris, to go to New France and start a new life. And these girls come to be known as les filles du roi, the king's girls, right? These girls are legendary in Quebec, right? So of course they weren't forced against their will. They were given an option. You can live in France and have an obscure life as an orphan, or you can move to New France and find a husband and start a new life in a new colony. So 900 girls agreed to do this. And King Louis XIV provided them with a substantial dowry to get them started, which is pretty impressive. And let me tell you more about these filles du roi. Over 900 of them came to New France in a decade, from 1663 to 1673. And les filles du roi are, of course, legendary today in Quebec, but I wanted to give you some more details about them. Because when I tell my students that, New France was founded by orphans, they all think, oh, it's kind of sad and pathetic. But I want to kind of tell you more about them. So here's a very wonderful article that I had my women's history students read this semester. And here's what it's called. It's called New France, and then it says Les femmes favorisées, right, which I'll just sort of hold that up there. It says New France, les femmes favorisées, which means in French what? French is easy to translate. Favorisée means what?
Favorites?
Yeah, the favored woman of New France. So why were they favored? Well, Jean Noël wrote this article in French, and of course it's been translated into English. Why were they favored? Well, there's a pretty good reason why they were favored, and it has to do with les filles du roi. And let me just turn to the page where she talks about who they were and what they had going for them. So these king's girls, the 900 girls that came to New France, brought with them pretty impressive cultural and cultural baggage. First of all, they were more educated than the average French woman. Because they had been brought up by nuns and not by regular mothers, they were ensured a very strict Catholic education. So number one, they were more educated. And the nuns in those days didn't just teach they taught domestic science. Mm-hmm. They taught women how to keep a house. But they were teaching orphans, right? They weren't teaching them rocket science, right? They were teaching them basic skills to be a good servant or a good wife or a good, domestic skills. how to bake bread, how to clean, how to be hygienic, how to. So these girls had received an excellent how to do needlework, right? How to domestic science. So these women were exceedingly well educated, more than the average. They were also probably more pious than the average French woman because they were brought up by nuns. So they were probably inculcated in Catholicism to a very heavy degree. In these orphanages, they probably went to Mass on a more regular basis.
Every day.
Oh, every day, absolutely. Jean Noël notes also that the majority of these filles du roi were urban dwellers. They weren't country illiterate peasants, they were Parisians, right? So they had that urban culture with them of, you're living in the most culturally dominant city in the world, right? They weren't from a remote part of like southwestern France. They were from the metropole of France. Jean Noël also finds that many of them were what she calls privileged urbanites. She says over 1/3 of them, about 340 of them, were educated at the Paris Hôpital Général, when Hôpital Général was probably just the name of a school. She says here that students at this institution learned writing and such a wide variety of skills that in France they were much sought after for service in the homes of the wealthy. 6% of the filles du roi were of noble or bourgeois origins, so they weren't all from impoverished backgrounds. And she notes that many of the filles, the girls, brought with them a dowry of 50 to 100 livres or pounds. And 50 pounds or 100 pounds in those days was like, $10,000 today. It was a lot of money.
Sure.
Some of them had their own personal funds, and they supplemented this to the order of 200 or 300 pounds. And 65 of the filles brought with them larger holdings in the range of 400 or 450 pounds. Some of them had private wealth that their parents had died and they had this money. So they came well funded. And the final point that Jean Noël makes is that the filles du roi spoke better French than most French women. Because France, in the 1600s, as France is today, there was no idea of a common French language. There were many different ways of speaking French depending on what province you lived in France. And it was really the French in Paris that managed to impose Parisian French as the national French. Right? You know that France, the north has the langue d'oeil and the south has the langue d'oc, a different kind of French, right? It's complicated stuff, right? So Parisian French sort of has this claims of hegemony of being the best French to this day, right? So these women spoke a purer French, and they brought that pure French with them to New France. Right?
As Boston has the best English, right?
Oh, I don't know. I think that's I think in America it's another, I think America is a whole other kettle of fish, right? I don't think one city in America can claim any kind of predominance, right? There's New York, Boston, there's too many potential contenders. Right, so you can imagine that when these young women arrived on the dock in Quebec City and came off of the boat, that they were snapped up, and it didn't matter how old they were. It didn't matter if they had infirmities or if they, limped a little bit or had missing teeth or whatever. These women were hot commodities because there were 8 men for every woman. So many of these girls married at the age of 13 or 14, so they were literally girls. Okay, so the filles du roi come. So we have the Régiment Carignan-Salière with soldiers, disbanded soldiers settling, and then we have the filles du roi. And most of the Régiment Carignan settlers settled in the Richelieu Valley because most of the seigneuries along the St. Lawrence had been granted, and these regiment was settled mainly in the Richelieu Valley, which is why my mom's road is named after one of the officers. It's a very beautiful name. It kind of sounds like rainbow. It's a very pretty name. So the filles du roi were snapped up and they became, they were married immediately. So here's the point of this long-winded, winding diversion, right?
That's a good one.
Just told you the history of New France, when all I really wanted to do was just answer a question. But see, there's no other way to answer this than to spend. How much time did I just spend?
It was very fascinating.
Fascinating, but okay, so the point here is that, this is the point, is that the coming of the soldiers from Carignan-Salière Regiment and the coming of the Filles du Roi was the largest infusion of population that this colony, the one and only infusion of population in this colony. Thereafter, pretty much almost no one came, or it just dribbled down back to what it was before. So here's what I want you to be able to see. That most people in Quebec can trace their ancestries back to a Filles du Roi or an officer of this regiment. And this explains, like if you look at the names of Quebec, like Tremblay, or the North Country Tremblay, there's probably a Tremblay in that regiment, or that, you know, so this explains why the Montreal phone book has these page after page of the same names. Because, you know, you have this one, imagine you have this like picture or this kind of snapshot where all these people came in the early 1660s, right? Let's say from 1660 to like 1675. You get this tremendous infusion of people, and thereafter no one else comes to widen the group. No one else comes to diversify the pool of potential names. So those few people that came then would be the sort of founding like names of the colony, and from then on everyone's going to have that group of names that came at that time.
A lot of similar DNA, huh?
Absolutely, they're all
Sure.
related.
Of course.
If you do your family tree, we have some people that meet at some
Sure.
point, yeah. So this is really interesting, right? So let's just like tidy this up by saying that, okay, so after the Carignan-Salière Regiment, after the Filles du Roi, the number of voluntary migrants to New France dribbles down back to what it was before. And then you got to add to this that the British conquest in 1759, right, the Battle of the Plains of Abrahams, the French are defeated. They come back the next year, try to win it back, and then the British float in their big flotilla down the St. Lawrence, and it's game over, right? So by like 1763, with the end of the 7 Years' War, New France now comes under British control. So obviously now you're really not going to get any French immigrants coming to New France because it's a British colony. Not only that, a lot of the more wealthy French people are going to go back to France, right? So you're going to lose, your elite is going to, those that could afford to go home and live under French laws did so, right? So again, from 1760 onward, there is relatively no migration from France. So the point of my diversion there was to make this point that the reason why there's this kind of finite number of names that you identify as old French names is that New France had this kind of very short span, intense settlement with these two groups that were kind of artificially brought here or convinced to come, and thereafter the settlement kind of fell off, and so you can trace. Not all French can trace. Like my name, for example, goes back to 1642. The first Beaudreau was a man called Urbain Gravelines, Urbain Beaudreau, dit Gravelines. And dit Gravelines means he came from a village in northern France called Gravelines. And he was a syndic in the city of Montreal, and he was killed by an Iroquois arrow, fighting the Iroquois. And I found news about his wife as I was doing research on another subject. So I know a little bit about my ancestor, but he was not part of that regiment. But my name's not a common name, right? So not all French names go back to that period of the royal administration, but many of them do. So that's something that people here might be interested in knowing.
But variations of your name are fairly common here.
No, because you're thinking of Beaudreau.
Okay, so
Right.
it's different.
Yeah, the
extract.
Beaudreaus come from Acadia. They're Acadian. They come originally from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick.
Beaudreau.
Yeah, Beaudreau is a completely different family from Beaudreau.
Okay.
Even though they sound the same. And it, of course, it bedevils every time, like anywhere we go. My father used to always complain about no one could ever spell our name because it's not the same name, right? We used to have an LT at the end, and that made it easier to. My grandfather dropped it. He thought it was silent, therefore why put it right?
Right.
But with the LT, it helped to distinguish it from Beaudreau. So at any rate, it's no big deal, right? A lot of people have hard names. And I'm not the only one. My students say to me, too many vowels.
Too many vowels, yeah.
They say like B-E-A-U, D-R-E-A-U. That's like too many vowels. We can't. You should see what my students call me, like Beaudreau, Bozo. No, I'm
Oh,
kidding.
Bozo.
They don't call me Bozo.
I've been called that, and my name doesn't sound anything like that at all.
Okay, let's go to, so now that we've had that tremendous preparatory speech,
I love it.
why don't we go to,
But it's perfectly clear to me. That's what I love about you. You know, you start with a...
I start with something-
You start with a hypothesis, and then you proved it.
I proved it. Oh, I don't know if I proved, well, I think, well, I'm making a, what's the word, it is hypothetical, but, you know, I'm trying to make a case and hoping that it works.
perfect sense,
But
and
yeah,
it's absolutely
it makes
true.
sense. Well, the book by
Phone
Peter
books,
Mook.
yeah, that.
The phone books say it, and Peter Mook says it, and all the studies that all the research I've done kind of confirms that. And I should probably also tell you that, pretty sure that if you go to Montreal or Quebec City, you're going to find restaurants called Xiv Reign. You're going to find, you know,
Oh, really? Oh, no kidding.
like, this is like, I don't know, what would you compare this to in America? If you're a descendant of like, if you do your genealogy, you're probably, you might just find that you have that your first ancestor was a Xiv Reign. Your maternal first ancestor came from, you know, Louis
Did they
XIV's
also
Paris.
call them daughters of the king?
Yes, yes, they're daughters of the kings, right? So, so the people of Quebec, this group of women who founded the colony, of girls who came bravely to this new land, have been mythologized like beyond belief in Quebec, right? It's like, it's part of the sort of lustrous heritage of Quebec to talk about les filles du roi. Everyone knows who they were, right? So it's culturally very significant. So what I want to do now is turn to my newly formed PowerPoint presentation here. I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint, but I thought this would work for this kind of thing. And rather than have me shuffle papers and, you know, on camera, it wouldn't look very good. Whereas this kind of really scrolls really well. So I'm kind of fascinated by this idea of assimilation, right? Or here's my hypothesis with what we're about to look at, which is, it's obvious that there are a lot of names in the North Country that have been changed or anglicized, and the question is, how and when did that happen, and why did that happen? Why did people change the spelling of their name? Right? When we looked at the phone book with all the Tremblays in Montreal, we had like 8 pages of them, and virtually each one is properly spelled. How come the ones in the North Country have all these variations? Like, what happened? Did people like forget how to spell it, or what happened? And I think the answer to that is probably that most of the people in the who came from Quebec in the United States in the early 19th century and beyond were most likely illiterate. Like most ordinary people in those days, there was no mandatory education, right? So, right, in America too, if I'm not mistaken. Children were frequently of better use on the farm or in the, in the factory, and therefore, you know, having language, being able to read and write was not really important. So in Quebec, if you couldn't read and write, that wasn't a problem, because wherever you dealt with, if, like, let's say you would go to the post office, or let's say you would go to your parish priest, and you needed to get married, and your parish priest would write your name for you, and he would know how to spell it, because he was educated. He'd write Tremblay the right way. And on your gravestone, it would say Tremblay the right way, right? And you'll see, if you look at documents from New France, where like people mark an X, or even here, I'm sure, that, like there's a witness, and someone will just mark an X. This is the mark of so-and-so, and someone witnesses it, which is a strange thing. So I actually think that the names changed as soon as they came to America. Whoever, like let's say someone called Tremblay would have some reason to have to write his name down in some public paper. Let's say he bought a house or a farm, and like the lawyer or the notary would say, you know, what's your name? And he would say, well, it's Asselin or whatever. And the guy would say, well, how do you spell that? And the immigrant would say, well, I don't know how you spell it. Or else the person would say, what does that mean? And the person would say, well, that means this. And they say, okay, and they would just translate it into English. So 2 things happen. You either have the French name becoming misspelt because it doesn't mean anything, but sometimes a French name would mean something, and therefore you could literally translate it. So Leblanc would become Mr. White, right?
Of course.
Blanc means white, so Mr. White. So because people did this, imagine, White is also a common English name. I'm assuming, right?
Sure.
So that means if you look in the phone book and you see like a page of whites, well, maybe half of those are French and half of those are English. So this is why this can't really be scientific, or it's hard to find a kind of scientific, a perfect measure. But I'm thinking that the perfect measure of how many people in this area have French names doesn't exist, and that it behooves us to overestimate it. Because, you know, if a name like White can be French, then gee, you know, you have to be cautious. People watching this show might think, oh, there's no way that I have a French name. You'd be surprised,
Yes.
you know. You might have a French name. Yeah. So let's have a look at some of, I mean, I'm also fascinated by the ways in which, like, French words, how they become, like, anglicized. And I think the point of my presentation is I want to make this case that the North Country names are wonderful. They're special. The French names of Louisiana are spelt differently than the French names of the North Country. That if you're in Louisiana, you'd probably put an X after your name.
You sure would.
Giroux would have an X after it, right? Yeah.
Beaudreau might too.
Beaudreau might too. Yeah. So you see, now here's what's so interesting. The same name of the same person would come to Louisiana, and they would end up being a Giroux with an X.
Of course.
The same family would come to the North Country, but here our methods of transcribing things would end up, you'd be a Giraud with an O.
Yep.
Probably. So anyhow, so we're going to look at some of the more common ways of transforming these names. And I also want to make a case for the fact that if you go up, there's a really fabulous old French cemetery that I've mentioned earlier, and you know, people who drive by up on Route 22 will see me there parked there going through it recently, and they'll say, what is that woman doing there? There's an old French cemetery in Tremblay Bay. It has a beautiful fence and a beautiful sign that says Tremblay Bay, and there's really old gravestones in it. And what you can see by looking at the gravestones is that people appear to have anglicized their names from the outset, from the moment they arrived here. In other words, it's not like people arrived in the 1840s and then each successive generation sort of varied their name. The first migrant who came would adopt a name, and that would be the one that would stick. That's why Tremblay has an E or an O, or you know, there's two branches.
This happened at Ellis Island too, with a lot of other immigrants where names were changed.
Sure.
From different nationalities.
Absolutely. They were anglicized. If they
All
had,
the time.
yeah, sure. If they were complicated names, they were either translated
Of
or
course.
anglicized. Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So we're just making a case here that I think it'll be fun for your audience too, because as they listen to it, they never know, their name might come up and you'll find
I
out,
love
you
it.
know, what it is. So if you're doing genealogy, it would help to know what their real name was spelt like, right? And I can, and in some cases, we're going to look at some pictures and like be able to talk about some people who actually had these names. So we're going from Ashline. My presentation is called North Country Names from Ashline to Yando. I couldn't find any names that ended with a Z, right? There was no Zibado or no names with Z, but I would have liked to get A to Z to have that kind of symmetry. But I could only go as far as Y, but that's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So the first name that I wanted to look at is this name called, there's two names here, Ashline and Ashlow. And Ashline sounds very English, doesn't it? Yeah, there's a lot of Ashlines in the North Country phone book. And the amazing thing is Ashline is not English at all. It's actually the name Asselin. Yeah, and you can see how Asselin would become Ashline, right?
Easily,
Yeah.
when you look at it, sure.
Sure. You imagine that, like, I don't know, a border patrol guard says, what's your name? And, you know, the guy says, Asselin. He goes, okay, how do you spell that? I don't know how you spell that. Okay, Asselin. Okay, that must be Ashline. Okay, we'll put that down. And then interesting, there's this name here, Ashlau, sounds like it could be somehow related to Ashline because it's got ash in it, but actually Ashlau is a completely different name that starts with an A-C-H. It's Ashlow. So Ashlow becoming Ashlau makes a lot of sense. So here's the North Country way of doing it is to put a W, which you would never see in Quebec, a W at the end of a name. Ashlau, like Ashlaw, Ashlaw. So how interesting that you go from Ashlow to Ashlaw. You're convinced though that that's the name, right?
Sure.
Yeah, totally. It makes total sense that would be it. Here's a really surprising one, Barrow.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
Yeah. Barreau is not Barreau at all, it's Perro.
But you can understand it now that I see it that way, but I never would have guessed it
Aha, I
in a
told you.
million
Oh,
years.
there's
I
a
love
lot.
it.
There's a lot more surprises
I
to
love it.
come. Yeah. So, Perrault, a very common French name, but you can kind of see how if you just say Perrault, 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 Barreau, it comes out being Barreau. And he, once again, I mean, this is me speculating. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure. I'm willing to like put some money on it. You know, if you wanna take me up on that, that's a good way of putting it. This one is another interesting French translation. Another pattern that you will see is this ending here, iye, iye, Y-E-A. That's an odd way to end a word or a name, right? Baye. So any North Country name that has a Y-E-A at the end of it, that's your first clue that it's got a French origin. So when I look at the word, I'll say, okay, what could that be? Baye, 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 baye. And I came up with bélier, bélier, which means a ram in French. Bélier, yeah. So the I-E-R here becomes Y-E-A, and the double L becomes a Y, because that is how you pronounce it, right?
That's how you say it, sure.
Yeah, like bélier, bélier, there's a y, bélier, right? There's a y in there somewhere, so that's where the Y-E-A comes from. So that's
Love
another North Country trope, is to see a Y-E-A, and there's quite a few of them. Bilo, Bilo or Bilo. I had a student named Bilo.
There are lots of bylaws in this.
Yeah,
area. Quite a few down around in Franklin County too, in Malone, right?
Yeah, Bilo, yeah.
Chateauguay,
Jack Bilo
Jack Bilo
has done a lot of research.
He's done a lot of genealogy, yeah.
has written a book on the subject, right?
He's writing one on this.
He's writing, he hasn't finished it yet.
The Bilo family,
Yeah.
what's the word, saga? I'm sure it's really
Is
interesting.
that from Chateauguay?
Well, no, the French spelling that she has up there, they first settled in the Coopersville area. And that's where the first Bilos came, was the Cooperville area. And they left there, and then Jack's family came from Chateauguay, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Interesting.
That's great.
Yeah, interesting, yeah. So probably if this was in New Orleans, it would be Bilou with an X, but instead it's Bilao or Bilo,
I'm sure you'll
yeah.
find at least 3 different spellings in our own phone book.
Sure. And if you go to Montreal, look in our Montreal phone book, you'll find Boileau as a very common name. Yeah, Boileau. Lots of vowels. The French names have lots of vowels. It's just, oh my God, now this is the most like,
This is great.
yeah. Well, this is fascinating, this one here, because, do you have a pen on you, Gordy?
Of
Have you got a
course.
pen? So I'll point with a pen rather than my finger in the screen. It's not so nice to look at a finger.
Gordy will lower his mic.
If Gordy will
Yeah,
lower
that's
his
so we
mic.
can see it.
Well, so here's 2 names, both of which start with Bush, right? But you have Bushy and then Bushal. And the most interesting thing here is, okay, let's look at the first one, Bushy. So here are all the permutations of Bushy. You have like Boucher, Bucci, Botcher, Bussy, Bushy, Bussy. And the one with the asterisk is the most common of all spellings. So as you look through all the names in the phone book, you'll find that there's one that predominates, and that's Bushy. So that's why I put Bushy of all of
Sometimes
them.
without the E.
Sometimes well, did I miss the, see, I'm missing some here, right? Sometimes without the E. Oh, there it is, without the E.
Oh, yes.
So I'm good, see, I've got them.
How about
Wait, no, hold on.
Oh,
You're getting ahead of me here.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
you're getting ahead. So interesting. I wasn't sure. Okay, then you get to Busky with a K. That's an interesting permutation.
Yeah.
Then Bussy, Busco. I'm not sure where Busco goes. I'm not sure how that O came there. Busha with an A. Boucher, Busha, right? And then Bushao. I'm not sure about that one. That's why I underlined it. And then just plain Bush. So who knows? Maybe President Bush is Franco-American. No, I'm kidding. No.
Uh-huh.
But I,
Butsky has many different spellings up here, too.
does it? So there's more than that? Busky?
Oh, yeah. B-O-U-S-Q-U-E-T,
Oh, Busquet. But that's another name. That's another name, Busquet.
but they pronounce it Busky.
Did they do? Yeah, there you go. But that's a whole other name. That will end up, so interesting. You'll have a Busky who's actually, okay, so the root name here is Boucher, which means in French a butcher, right? There's a city in Quebec called Boucherville, which means, well, originally in France you'd be a butcher if you were a boucher. So It's possible. My point was to show not only these, this is one of the most common names of the North Country, but to show that you also have the name Bashaw and Basaw and Bushaw. And so I found Bushaws in the Bushies, and I found Bushaws that are Bushaws. That's a different name, Bushaw. So you can see here how two names, Boucher and Bouchard, come up with kind of permutations that kind of resemble one another.
Yep.
But they're not the same family. So I underlined Bouchard in both of them because I wanted to kind of highlight that I'm not sure. I have a hunch that Bouchard is Bouchard because it has the R, Bouchard,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And that how would you go?
agree.
How would you go from Boucher to Bouchard? I don't think so. So I think this might not belong there. It might be one that doesn't. But Bosquet is another name that means a little hedge, and that's another French name. But see, this could go on, maybe we need to create a giant internet repertory and have people like keep on adding to it.
Yeah.
We've just begun this, so now that I know the PowerPoint,
Who
right?
else is doing this kind of study?
Nobody.
I love it.
Nobody. It's a first.
You can go to Keysville, and they've got a lot of this there for you.
At the
Canadian
Northern
genealogy.
New York,
Yeah.
Genealogy Society, they've done a lot of that. Yeah, we've
Yeah.
talked about it in the past, but not on this scale. This is wonderful.
Well, there's I don't know, there's a lot of these, yeah. So a bushy, aren't there like these really good baked beans that are made by, is it Bushy or Bush? Bush's baked beans?
Bush's baked beans.
Bush.
Bush baked beans, yeah.
I'm wondering if that's not,
Bush baked beans. I saw a commercial last night, and this guy says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so Bush," and he talks about the baked bean. Roll the footage with those delicious beans, he
oh,
says.
yeah. But
Of
you know,
course, being a
what's in,
foodaholic, it really caught my attention.
but you know what, Gordy and Calvin, you all know that baked beans are the French-Canadian specialty, right? Par excellence. Boston as well, but French too. So we need to find out about the original Bush and see if he was maybe one of these
Or
Bushies.
Grandma Brown.
Or Grandma
Grandma
Brown,
Brown.
which is a whole different ballgame. I love it.
Oh, interesting, yeah. I once visited, I was doing research on the Franco-Americans of Lewiston, Maine. It was Easter time, and this Franco-American family invited me for Easter brunch, and this woman, sort of elderly woman, came to have Easter brunch with us, and they were serving all these things, including like baked beans. She wouldn't eat any baked beans and it was clear that she had eaten so much of them in her youth that she was like,
Turned off the baked beans.
Yeah.
I had a lot of my youth, and I had some for supper last night, and I'll have some more for supper
oh,
tonight.
beans on toast, it's wonderful. Oh, yeah, you gotta love them. Here's another interesting.
Oh, yes.
Here's an interesting one with both words have B-O in them. Both words have Y-E-A in them, but one has a U and one doesn't. So if you were just to look at Boyer and Bouyer, you'd say, okay, maybe these are the same name, but they're not. Because Boyer, which is, the original French is spelled Boyer, turned into Boyer. So you don't pronounce the R as an R, you pronounce it Boyer in French. So the North Country version of it is exactly how it sounds, Boyer, right? But then you have another name in French called Bouvier. There's a lot of Bouviers in the North Country. It's a common French name. But Bouvier was translated as Bouvier with an A, which also makes sense because that's how you pronounce it. And Bouyer, which also sounds like Bouvier, it's the same name. So essentially you have the translation is Boyer and Bouyer. And you would think they were the same name, but they're not. They're two different names. As you can see, Boyer with a Y and Bouvier with a V are not the same, right? But they both ended up looking the same with a Y. The V turned into a Y. Bouvier, Bouyer. Right?
That's very interesting.
It is very interesting, yeah.
Leander Bouyer and Bouyer Bakery.
Yeah, where's Mr. Bouyer? We have a picture of him, so let's show who he is. Mr. Leander Bouyer is pictured. Oh, by the way, I want to show you this wonderful book. I want to sort of promote this wonderful book here, which has fallen out of his dust jacket because we have a very amateurish situation set up here. Here's a very wonderful book here called, it's to celebrate Plattsburgh Centennial, and it's called Plattsburgh, New York, a City's First Century, and it's by Richard Frost, who has done a kind of champion's work putting this book together. Basically, it's got lots of wonderful pictures inside that sort of show you Plattsburgh's, here's a page that shows us the French heritage par excellence. You have the teaching nuns teaching the nurses, holding an artificial heart. Here's some teaching nuns with their nursing graduates. So this book is a treasure trove of photos of Plattsburgh's very rich and diverse history. So I urge your viewers, if they're interested in these matters, to pick up this book because it's a great cultural treasure. So it has some great photos in it, and let's look at Mayor Leander Bouyer is pictured in here. He was a mayor during the Depression and he was credited with seeing Plattsburgh through the worst years of the Depression in a rather effective way. So there you see Mayor Bouyer, and it says, Mayor Leander Bouyer, shown here at dedication ceremonies for the Plattsburgh Public Library in 1940. He's speaking into an old microphone. It says he governed to great acclaim despite the challenges of depression and war. And there's a quote. It says, "His administration has been capable, honest, and with the welfare of every man, woman, and child in mind." So, then this was proclaimed by the supporters of a sixth term. So someone thought he should run for office a sixth time. So obviously he was a pretty good mayor. Had a lot of longevity. And I also included here the Bouyer Facet's Bakery in Plattsburgh, because that's actually, both names are French, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it started out as the Bouyer Bakery and then joined Facets.
And Facets is a translation of Facet with an E. The name in Quebec would be Facet, but somehow it became Facet. Not small. It's a small difference.
But there are a number of facets in this area. I ran into one yesterday. Gordy, you don't remember me. I'm Fuzzy Facet.
Fuzzy Facet. What a great name.
Isn't it beautiful?
There you go. I knew that was going to happen. The whole thing collapsed. Fuzzy Facet.
I'm going to tell Fuzzy. He blew up the whole table.
Oh God! Well, what I also love about the North Country is that often you'll have people with their first name and it'll be something like Frenchie Facet.
Yeah, of course.
They'll call them, like, they work in a shop and everyone.
Frenchie Sabrin is a perfect
Frenchie
example. A very
Sabrin, yeah.
prominent politician, and his son is a politician here now. And he was a most beloved personality.
Yeah.
Frenchie. How
Yeah.
about the name Boyer or Boyer? B-O-I-R-E.
Boire.
B-O-I-R-E.
That's boire.
There was a flower shop here under that name, and I always called it Boyer's.
It is Boyer.
Boyer,
Boyer,
and,
but many people pronounce it Boyer.
and many of the families involved called it Boyer. And I noticed I was the only one doing that commercial who called it Boyer's Flower Shop.
No, Louis Boyer, they always said Boyer, but there are many people, like linoleum, some people can't pronounce linoleum.
There you go.
Aluminium.
And some people can't pronounce Boyer.
Like this,
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
That might be a variation of Boyer.
Well, that's why I mentioned it here.
See, I'm learning too, yeah. So maybe on my list I should have had, because I don't think that, well, we can check in the Quebec phone book, because I don't think Bois is a second name of Quebec.
Really?
I don't, well,
up there,
we
huh?
can check it, but my gut instinct, which is usually pretty good, tells me that there's not a name called Monsieur Bois. I've never heard of it, but I could be wrong, like, I'm not omniscient,
Yes, you are.
No, I'm no, totally, so not. Yeah, it's not even in the book. Beaudreau, there you go, scads of Beaudreau's, but no Bois. So Bois is, let me make sure I've got this right here. I'm not even in the right. B-O-I, right? I'm over in the U's, which is no good at all. Bolduc, Boisvert, okay, we're close. Boisvert, Boivin. There's no Bois.
Oh, B-O-I-R.
Yeah, we go from, I could be right. No, I could be wrong. Bois is with an S.
I love it.
Bois, the suspense is killing us. Bois Clair. There's a lot of woods, right? There's a lot of woods.
Yeah.
Boileau, and we will settle this matter here. It's happening like live to air. Boileau, okay, now this is looking good. Boileau. And Boilly. Bois. Okay, here's Bois. Bois starts here. Bois. There's some Bois. Yep, there is Bois. We got a few. Yep. So.
Maybe 20.
Yeah, not many. Small.
They came here and went back.
Yeah, but many people who are now spelled Boyer, B-O-Y-E-R, up here, I think were originally Boyer,
B-O-I-R. So they've undergone several changes, sure. Yeah.
because
Oh.
people cannot pronounce Boyer.
Oh, yeah. No, I suppose you're right. It's like, I went to high school in Moira, M-O-I-R-A, and amazingly, most journalists have no clue about how to say that. So they call it Mariah if they're from here, and then there's mass confusion because they're two different places entirely. But, I called the wind Moira long before I went to school there. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see all that,
it
Bois is a
is.
small name, yeah. So, yeah, it goes in many directions and it's kind of amorphous, yeah. Let's get another one.
Another very popular North Country
Yeah,
name, my
Bruno,
goodness.
yeah. So Bruno it sounds vaguely Italianate, or it sounds like it could be, I don't know what it could be. It doesn't sound very French.
I always thought of it as French, though.
Did you?
I don't know why. We have a lot of Bruno families up here and important politicians.
Well, I
Bob-
just put
Bob
here
Bruno.
that, current New York State Senate Majority Leader is Joe Bruno. And I asked myself, could he also be of French-Canadian heritage? Joseph Bruno, I don't know, that sounds pretty French to me. You've got to ask him, yeah.
I would think the Bruno family and...
He's from Malone. No, he's not from Malone, no.
No, but we have North Country politicians here. Bob Bruno, who winters in Florida, comes up here in the summer,
Yes.
who's, was a politician, chairman of the legislature, and for a long time, and a very popular race car driver.
Oh.
But I always thought of their family as being of French extraction.
Yeah, Robert Bruno, right? Bob
Yeah.
Bruno, yeah. So that's another one that, and Bruno can be a first name too, so it's kind of interesting the way that it's spelt. Anywhere else in the world, if you showed them that name, they'd have no clue that was French.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's, again, it's kind of hypothetical. Carter is another local name that sounds very English, doesn't it? Mr. Carter, right? And I'm sure that many of the Carters are of Anglo origin, but Carter in the North Country is probably just an anglicization of Cartier. And I wrote here that this is probably the ultimate historical name since the founder of Canada was Jacques Cartier. And the name's a common one because Carter means one who carries, right? And in French as well, Cartier means someone who carries. So it's a humble origin name, right?
Sure.
Like Boucher, that means butcher. The Carters were the people who carried things, at least originally, the original group. So yeah, that's another interesting North Country name that doesn't look French at all. Dachau. Dachau is actually English for Deschenaux.
This I knew because we have so many Dagenaws in our family,
Uh-huh.
so we're very familiar with it.
Yeah. Again,
They're all very proud of their French heritage.
Yeah, again, if you see that AW after the name, it's your first clue that it's anglicized French. Because the
I would never
EAU,
have known this spelling.
exactly. See, the EAU here is
Of course.
turned into AW.
Yep.
And so, that's the pattern that we see in the North Country names, is that, that it's true that EAU, if an American looks at that, they don't know how to pronounce that. Is you pronounce that O or Yo, or so by putting A, you can see how Deschenaux becomes, that's an interesting one, because Deschenaux to Dachau, it's a big jump.
All right, we've been looking through phone books
having a big debate.
between takes here about where the name Dachau came from, and yes, it could have come from
yeah.
two different names.
Absolutely.
That just makes the subject even more enticing and interesting, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And like I said, it's not a perfect science. So, nothing that I'm saying here, I have no claims of certainty and absolute, correctness that in some cases I could be completely wrong. But that's the whole point of that. What's interesting about it is that, but see, you only really know if someone like yourself or someone like Calvin, remembers a family from somewhere that,
Yeah.
might not be around anymore. So it's good stuff. And
There's nothing
it's endless.
wrong with inspiring people to start their own searches.
Yeah.
And to let us know in the future so we can add to things like
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
And
We have a data
a
bank
lot of
now.
what you do,
Yeah.
as I told you before the camera started, inspires me, makes you want to run right out and look through the phone book and see how many ways you
Wow.
can figure it out. But it's
Oh.
it's a huge puzzle.
It's a huge puzzle, and it's like a pointillist painting with every little spot is one different kind of shade of something, and it's like putting it all together is daunting. So
Could-
I have a lot of cheek, or I have a lot of, what's the word, bravado to even attempt this.
Cheek is good. It may take you 30 years to write that book, though.
Yeah, I know. I'm not gonna get promoted very fast with that kind of a subject. It's not gonna come
What
out.
Sylvie said before we started the camera after our search through all the phone books here is, we didn't even get through the D's. All this planning over the last 48 hours that we didn't even get through the D's. But you know what? As usual, we've had a wonderful time doing this.
We have.
Can you remember where you stopped the next time we come?
Yes, I can remember. Absolutely.
We may have to do these we may have to do a new one once a month.
I think so.
Did the season go well for you in school? How were the classes? Good?
The season it went exceedingly well. It was interesting. I had a class, a survey course that was in Yoakum, and they put me in this. It was a class of 40 students, and it's a survey of post-Confederation Canada. And they put me in a classroom that seats 200.
Oh my goodness, a lot of echoes.
So I had the students all sit in the first 4 rows, and I thought it was going to be a disaster. I thought it was going to be the worst class that
It turned out to be really
And to add to it, also, this room was a so-called smart room, right? With PowerPoint and like
sure.
computer and like rear screen projection and this computer terminal like touch tone and a computer slid underneath it, and you could have like internet sort of beamed up onto a screen. You had screens going up, screens coming down, buttons here, buttons there, and I thought there was just no way I'm ever going to be able to deal with this. But I had no choice because it was at a popular time. They couldn't move it out of there. So I morphed into like a technology queen, right? Like I figured there's nothing you can't learn, right? And my students helped, they helped me out. I had one student who once worked at Verizon. He was like my technical assistant.
I love it.
So with all these gizmos, right, with like computers, I could go onto web pages and show them stuff, and so I just got totally into it. And by the end of it, I had them singing. We sang a Vietnam War protest song, and I would sing something, and they'd respond, and we recorded it. So I just think we had so much fun in that class. Like I showed them like comedy clips, I showed them films. We had a great class. It was a memorable class. And at the last class, a student came up to me who was about to graduate, and she came up to me and she said, Dr. Beaudreau, she goes, I just want to thank you for making making my last class at PSU so memorable. Because I'd had them sing,
Isn't that great?
And I just thought, wow,
She'll tell her children and grandchildren about that too, and that's neat.
They all loved it. They loved the fact that I made them sing, and they thought, how, I guess they appreciated that because it was brave of me to do that, Yeah. So
it's wonderful if you can't interject a little humor and a little good time.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad way to get the subject matter over.
Yes.
You have to open the door before you can
absolutely
force feed the snake. You got to get its mouth open.
You get people laughing and they kind of relax their, what do you call it, their solar plexus, or they sort of get like, dilated, and they go, oh, maybe this isn't going to be so like.
Laughter is indeed the best medicine.
Maybe this isn't going to be this kind of drudgery, boring, harsh thing. Maybe, this might actually be fun. So.
This subject matter for me is exciting and stimulating and wonderful, and I know it is for Calvin too. When Calvin will stop the camera and go rifling through a phone book to find out where his Dajnas came from, you got to him.
I know.
Sylvie, thanks so much once again for doing it. Have a delicious and delightful summer.
I will.
You've got this already in your brain, and on the PowerPoint, it'll never go away.
No, we're going to keep adding to it. It's like Calvin's going to help me add things to it.
I can't wait to get to the Q's. Can you?
There is names that start with Q. Canel.
I love it. Dr. Sylvie Beaudreau from Plattsburgh State in this wonderful historic Champlain Hall. Just a wonderful place. It's a beautiful spring day. We're all going to get out and get into the sunshine before it decides to rain this coming weekend toward the end of May. Thank you for watching this program. Of course, we always welcome your suggestions and, your compliments or your comments, whether they're positive or negative. It helps us go in a direction that you like, and that's what we're here for. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.